Greetings everybody, we are at S4 in Tampa. We got Eric Byres, which needs no introduction, successful entrepreneur, four acquisitions so far, four exits?
Yeah, four startups,
Four startups sold successfully. Now the VP at Cyber Supply Chain Integrity at Exiger. Maybe we'll start with the last acquisition that was focused on SBOMs. A lot of people think that solves all the problems, some people may think differently. What's your opinion?
Yeah, so I think SBOMs get too much, people think they're the magic bullet, but they're just a really necessary information source. They're the ingredients list. You know, you think of a can of soup, you get ingredients on the side of the can of soup, and they tell you information, but they don't tell you whether those ingredients are good or bad. That's not included. And same with SBOMs. SBOMs are a necessary information feed into your risk analysis, but they're not a risk analysis on their own. And you need both. You need, these are the ingredients, these are the third-party components, this is what's embedded in my software, and oh, this one looks scary. But that scary is a separate risk analysis.
Thank you for that. And SBOM, software bill of materials, I'm sure everybody's aware, but I just wanted to define that. Talking about how can industrial organization detect second or third tier supply chain risks before they impact the operations?
Yeah, well that's, I think, the best time to do it. I mean, you're absolutely right. After you've got something installed and running in your plant floor, you're kind of scrambling. So my philosophy has been, let's tear apart every piece of software you plan to move onto the plant floor. And if you're running a facility, then it's going to be every new piece of software or every upgrade. Tear it to pieces and find out every contributor to that software. Because I can assure you, with typical piece of software in OT, only maybe 10, 20, maybe if you're lucky, 30% of the software came from the company you bought it from, and the rest is open source, third-party license. I mean, some of it's pretty obvious, if you're putting together a piece of software that is going to be talking on the Ethernet, it's not going to be using drivers from, it's going to be using Intel drivers, right? And so you need to know that there's Intel drivers, or maybe they're Huawei drivers, or maybe they're, you need to know where that software came from. And so it's really doing that analysis before you deploy it is the right time. And then at that point, you can see way, way, way down. Like, people talk about second and third tier. We've seen, I think the deepest tier we ever saw was 35th tier. Like, here's an open source package, then use this, and use this, and use this, and use this. 35 tiers later, we find some supplier. So.
Right, so when I think of operations technology, I think of folks that get measured to keep the process running.
Yeah.
Who are this? Is this the IT stepping in to look at those details?
It depends. We get both types of, we sometimes just procurement. They're really fascinated,
right.
And that's really, again, that's probably the best place is like, well, you filled out that little piece of paper that says you got good security practices, but before we actually going to buy it, we're going to analyze your software. And we've seen, tier one companies supply software. I mean, we saw a tier one company supplying software to one of the major oil and gas companies well after the Log4j wreck. With Log4j in it, like with the wrong versions of Log4j, the infected versions. I didn't blame the supplier. It's really hard when you've got development centers all over the world and developers can be a little cowboy. But without the analysis, it was showing that, wait a second, you're selling us very risky software. Why don't you go back home and try it again? Right. And they did. They did a great job. They cleaned it up. They got rid of the Log4j. But, that's the first type of customer we see. The second type are people who have actually deployed it, and they are, running a system, and there's all sorts of, they've got all sorts of embedded systems, and they're just trying to get a handle. That's usually driven by the IT department. First of all, do we have a Log4j software in our entire OT network? Where is it? Help, quick, find it. Where do I have to put some firewall rules or whatever it is, or some third party you don't want? And so we usually see that mix. IT people trying to get control of what they have on the plant floor.
Right.
Almost like an extended asset inventory. For the last decade, we've been fighting to get a decent asset inventory of what's plugged into the network. Now we need to find out what software is running on that thing that got plugged on the network.
Now, are there unconventional indicators beyond the traditional cybersecurity metrics? And we're still talking downstairs, what is the right metric? I think there's an award for that.
Yeah.
That you can spot potential vulnerabilities?
Yes. Well, first of all, I mean, there's vulnerabilities.
Right.
You know, and I class most vulnerabilities as just bad coding, bad practices, you know, mistakes. And there's a whole class of cybersecurity risk. But then there's the whole class of metrics that we need to consider about how risky is that open source project, how risky is that, you know, how risky is the entity that's creating that software. Maybe nobody knows if there's a vulnerability. Maybe, you know, there was a really good talk by Otorio yesterday, I think, at the show, and he talked about, like, there's all these products out there with no vulnerabilities. Are you kidding me? They have vulnerabilities. They are just not known vulnerabilities.
Right.
So what do you do? And the thing you try and do is say, well, if we can't find the actual vulnerability, we want to understand the risk that entities' practices have. And sometimes that risk isn't just stupid mistakes. Sometimes the risk is malicious. And I'll give you a very specific example. We were doing an analysis of identity scanning software for a large entity in the United States. And guess what? We find some optical character recognition software in this basically, you know, ID scanning system. Okay, you'd expect it's an open source project.
Right.
Okay, are there any vulnerabilities listed against it? Nope. Is it a happy path? No. Who are the developers? Who are the maintainers of that project? Oh, 3 guys from mainland China who work for the Chinese military. Oh, this is not going well. It gets worse. What does it contain? Okay, break the SBOM down a little further. Here's no an open source product, openly available on the web, maintainers are suspect. Second, what components are embedded in that? Oh, nothing but a little remote access VNC server. That thing was designed to call home.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not a vulnerability in the sense of I'm going to go look it up in the National Vulnerability Database. It's
right.
a vulnerability that is designed in.
Now, zero trust is gaining popularity, or yet might still have some challenges in the supply chain. And how real is the threat, for instance, for back-end components in industrial hardware, and what companies should be doing to verify their integrity?
Oh, it's bad and getting worse. I mean, honestly, I mean, when I see things like the example of us finding deliberate backdoors in open source projects, you know, another example that most people watching this may know of is the Exiger utilities scandal that happened a little while ago. You know, there is a concerted effort by nation states to embed teams into open source projects so that they can embed hidden backdoors. So, and this ain't going to improve. This is going to go only one way, and it's downhill. And if we don't have the tools to defend against it, we're sitting ducks. We're done. And now that doesn't mean, I want to actually add one more thing. It's really about awareness. Like, what do you do? Okay, great. They've got a VNC server embedded in my software that's controlling my cracking tower. Whoa, problem. You have a whole series of decisions here, and one of them is to tear the software out, but that may not be possible. But okay, let's firewall that sucker off. Well, let's make sure it never can call home, right? So there's all sorts of mitigating controls we can do once we identify the risk.
Speaking of the risk, what's an emerging supply chain risk that nobody's talking about yet they should be?
Well, I don't know if there's any that nobody's talking about, but I think people aren't aware of it. And the one example I give you is, I'm really concerned right now about the open source market, not because open source is bad. We need open source. People should not roll like complex crypto libraries in-house. You'll end up with more vulnerabilities than you knew what. You know, this stuff is complex. When you get something like OpenSSL, that's an open source project that has seen the test of time and still had its share of vulnerabilities. So I don't say, like, let's chuck out the open source, but you know, there's a whole world of difference on open source projects, on their practices, who the maintainers are. So it's really critical to not just say, ooh, ugly open source. No, it's what are the practices, what's going on, how did that open source get created, who's contributing to it, who's the maintainers. And again, by the way, this absolutely applies to proprietary software. You know, who's the developer of that proprietary software? Where did it come from? Again, I've seen proprietary software come in that's got a nice made in the USA badge on it, and we dig under the covers and that's not being written here.
Eric, thank you so much for sharing the insights, and look forward to host you in the future IoT World Days.
That'd be great, I'd love it. Looking forward to it.